picking up from where we left off on a previous video where I introduced the for each, and this is where we actually have a UI element text that is being iterated over based on this array. So we have an array of cities and we are iterating over those favorite cities and we are creating these elements based on that. Now, one of the things that's a little cryptic about this is that we had to do this ID : \self, which this looks a little odd, and we don't cover it a lot in class, mainly because it is something that is not used very often in Swift. It is used in Swift UI, but only because this array right here is not considered identifiable, which means that every element in the array is not necessarily unique. Or the system, Swift, has no way of knowing what it should look at to determine if it's unique. So for example, if we had listed Boston twice, would that mean that they are really referencing the same thing? So what is important here is when Swift UI creates all of these UI elements here, it's important that when it does that, it has a way to uniquely identify them. And that is important because when we go for a change in state, so for example, let's suppose that this was actually a state variable in here, which we can do now. Why don't I just do that? I'll put it inside here, and I'm going to say at state, and let's go ahead and resume this. And essentially what we're doing is we're saying that once we iterate over these cities and we put them in, we need to have a unique way of identifying what to change in our view hierarchy if one of these things changed in the array. And that's the important thing, because Swift UI doesn't want to re-render the entire view completely on the phone. What it wants to do is only re-render those things that it needs to. And it needs to be able to do that by uniquely identifying each one of these elements. So there's another way to do this where we don't have to use this, and that is to make this a data structure that is uniquely identifiable, which means that it conforms to the identifiable protocol. So the way we do that is we're going to just create a struct, and we'll call it favorite cities. And I'm going to say that it conforms to the identifiable protocol. And notice here it says, hey, this does not conform to the protocol, but it looks like it's got a suggestion for how it could. And so what we can do is click on this and say, go ahead and fix it by adding in whatever stubs. Stub is just basically a word for a function or a property or whatever, where it sort of fills it out to start with, and then you fill out the rest. So it's going to say fix, and here we are. We have this var ID, and then they put in a type here called object identifier. Now, what we want to do is we want this ID to be a property. If this property ID is here, then it's going to assume that that is going to create something that is uniquely identifiable for every time we declare something of that type struct. So here I'm going to say, you know what, we're going to make this a string, and we're going to make it equal to UUID string. So I have a video on UUIDs. Just as a reminder, though, UUIDs are basically these long string of characters, numbers, and dashes that every time you ask for one, you get a unique one. And it can take a long time for even a 50% chance for duplicate to ever occur. So long, in fact, that we will always assume that this will absolutely be a unique string every time we call it. So here we have var ID string gets this unique ID, and notice we have no more warnings. So identifiable has now been met. We have conformed to the identifiable protocol by adding this ID property. So let's go ahead and put the other part, which will be, let's say city is going to be a string, And now we have the ID and then the city with the string being what we want to store. So now down here in favorite cities, instead of this being a array of just strings like we have here, we want it to be an array, but we want it to be an array of these structs. So what I'm going to do is say favorite cities, and then I'm going to, you see it's asking for ID city or just city. And here we can just do city because we've already supplied a default. Every time we create a struct from this, it's going to do this. So that's going to be done by default, so we don't need to supply that. So we can just pick this initializer, city, and then I can go ahead and put in the name of that city, and then do comma, and then I like to come down to the next line and do this again. So what I'm going to do is fill in all of these. So as we come down here, we have a few errors because we haven't referenced all of this properly now that it's been changed to an array of structs rather than strings. So the first thing we can do, though, is we can take this out because favorite cities is of this, it's an array of this type, and this type, this struct, is identifiable, which means that every iteration of this is going to be identifiable by default, so we don't have to have the ID, which is what we're trying to get away from. Now, in text here, it passes back a city, but what it's passing back here is actually a struct, where city is actually a property here. So we could say, I'm going to just rename this so that it's a little clearer because we're not repeating city twice. So why don't we say favorite. And then down here, I'm going to do favorite dot city. And when I do that, I'll do Command B to compile, see if we get a good compile. So it's thinking. Yep, we have a build succeeded. If we come over here to resume, resuming our UI, we should get green light preview, and we are seeing all of our items. So at this point, what we've done is we have now successfully gotten rid of that ID : /self, which is rather cryptic, and we say, no, we're just going to iterate over favorite cities. And the reason we can do that is because it's an array of items that happen to conform to identifiable. And because the protocol says you must have one property called ID, it can't be named anything else, and it's up to you to make sure that whatever value you give it is unique, then you have conformed to it, and now you can just say for each without the ID.